in this section, we're talking about how your menstrual cycle even works. Um, this will definitely pull back in some of those hormones that we covered briefly in the at the end of the anatomy section. And again, that anatomy section was really anatomy and physiology, and physiology just being a fancy word for biological function. So how biological system works, basically. Um, in this one, what we're going to do is take a closer look at some graphs so you're able to see, actually visualize, like lay your eyes on how each one of these hormones is changing throughout your cycle. And the reason why this is important is because these hormones impact how your body behaves throughout your cycle. And so this is, again, setting that foundation, setting that groundwork for what we're going to talk about next, which is what things within your body change. And these things are called biomarkers. It's kind of a fancy way of saying things that change in response to changing hormone levels within your body. So we're going to, well, it doesn't have to be changing hormone levels. It could be changing levels of whatever within your body. In this particular case, it's changing hormone levels within your body. So anyways, it's really helpful to take a look, see this visually, so you know, kind of it cues you in. This will be a download as well. There will be just a one sheet download where you can do a quick reference, see, be reminded quickly of which hormone we're talking about, where it's dominant in the cycle. So let's go ahead and get into it. There's a couple different ways to think about your menstrual cycle. One of those is kind of a 6-phase view of your menstrual cycle. We'll walk through this pretty quickly. So the first phase, this would be when your period starts. This is arbitrarily assigned as day 1 of your cycle. During your period, your reproductive hormones are, and here when I say reproductive hormones, I mean estrogen and progesterone specifically, are at their lowest point, and your uterine lining that's been built up all month from that previous cycle is being released or being shed. The second phase in this 6-phase view is your follicular phase. So your estrogen is rising during the follicular phase of your cycle. This is due to follicular stimulating hormone being secreted by your pituitary gland at the base of your brain. And that follicular stimulating hormone, again, is stimulating all of the developing follicles within your ovaries to develop. And those follicles are in a race to see who can grow biggest, the fastest, and be the strongest. Because they'll need that strength, they'll need that size when estrogen sends that, through that feedback loop, sends that message to the brain to shut off follicular stimulating hormone. And at that point, the only one that will survive the famine, so if you remember, FSH is essentially the food for those developing follicles. The only follicle that's strong enough to survive the famine of FSH is the dominant follicle. So it is very competitive, in which like your reproductive cycle is very competitive. Those developing follicles are really competing to see which one grows biggest, strongest, fastest. So this kind of leads us into the third phase. This is your pre-ovulatory phase. During this phase, your luteinizing hormone levels spike. And generally, luteinizing hormone begins to surge about 12 hours before you ovulate. But sometimes it's hard to tease out when that surge begins, because we're almost always monitoring urinary values of your luteinizing hormone. And when your luteinizing hormone in your urine starts to surge is typically hours after it's already surged in your bloodstream. So this makes it a little hard to tease out exactly when you have that LH spike. The fourth phase, ovulation. The mature egg is released from the ovary in response to that luteinizing hormone surge. This is a very fast phase. Once the egg is released from your ovary, it's only viable for about 24 to 36 hours. So that's about a day to a day and a half. And it's during this time when you're fertile. Now, the good news is your fertile window is longer than a day to a day and a half, and we'll talk about why here in the next segment. The fifth phase of your cycle, your luteal phase. So during this phase, the ovary that produced your egg that month continues to make estrogen and also begins making progesterone. And when I say the ovary that released your egg that month, it's really that corpus luteum. So it's the empty house. It's that empty follicle that's left behind when the egg burst from it. While that was making estrogen prior to ovulation, now it continues to make a little bit of estrogen and more progesterone during your luteal phase. Your luteal phase lasts all the way up to the start of the sixth phase, which is your premenstrual phase. And during this time, your ovary stops making progesterone because that corpus luteum is dying or in the process of disintegrating. And so both your progesterone and your estrogen levels fall. And when those two hormones plummet, your uterine lining doesn't have, it's no longer receiving the nourishment that it needs. And so it sloughs off and dies and is, or it dies and is sloughed off in preparation for trying again the next cycle. So that's the 6-phase view of your menstrual cycle. Now let's look at a very simple 2-phase view of your menstrual cycle. So in this, when we look at it this way, your whole cycle is divided into 2 halves. There's the pre-ovulatory, and this starts on cycle day 1, and it goes all the way up till ovulation. So this is also, this would be synonymous with your follicular phase. And then there is post-ovulatory. So this is from the time that you ovulate up until the time that you start your next period. So this is kind of a much simpler view of your cycle. That second half, that post-ovulatory phase would be, is also referred to as the luteal phase. So this is the time when progesterone is dominant. So this is another way of thinking of it as estrogen dominant phase of your cycle and progesterone dominant phase of your cycle. So the estrogen dominant phase would be before ovulation, and the progesterone dominant would be after ovulation. This is also just a diagram or a quick chart of a chart of what each one of these hormones is doing throughout your entire cycle. So we'll start off with this follicular stimulating hormone. You'll notice that it is higher. It is, so first of all, it is very low during your luteal phase, all the way up maybe until a day or 2 before you start your period. And then it rises, and it continues to rise and kind of peak at about the same time that your estrogen starts to rise. So the colors are a little hard to see here, but this is the green line for your follicular stimulating hormone. Again, very low during your luteal phase, except for maybe that last day or 2 when it starts to rise, and then it continues to rise and kind of peak here at cycle day 6 or 7. And if we move over and look at our estrogen curve, which is this blue line, you'll see that it is really beginning to take off right around that day 6 or 7. And so it continues to rise up until around ovulation day, and then falls off, and typically there's a second estrogen surge about 7 days into your luteal phase. However, you'll still notice that progesterone, which was pretty much non-existent during your follicular phase or your pre-ovulatory phase, starts to rise here on ovulation day and peaks and stays the dominant, which means there's more of it throughout your entire luteal phase compared with estrogen. So even though there's this secondary estrogen spike during your luteal phase, your progesterone is still dominant. And then the very last one is this yellow luteinizing hormone. So luteinizing hormone levels stay really consistent throughout most of your cycle, both pre and post ovulation, with the exception of ovulation itself. And this is where you'll see a really dramatic surge, really dramatic spike in luteinizing hormone, right ahead of ovulation. And so, with that, let's move on to the next module.